Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's session. My name is Nthabiseng Moleko. I'm faculty from the University of Stellenbosch Business School, and I'm so grateful to have you join us for today's session. Just a little bit of an introduction before I get into it. I teach statistics and economics at the USB to our MBAs. You may be a little bit surprised why I'm talking about a new world of work, but it's because it affects all of us, and there should be no one who cannot speak on this, particularly after the pandemic we're experiencing. I'm also what we call a commissioner at the Commission for Gender Equality. I serve as a deputy chairperson. It's a Chapter 9, where we advance women's economic empowerment, gender transformation, and policy and legislative reforms in the nation. And we oversee and monitor the state, and also participate in various boards of entities in the country. So with that, I'll get into the presentation. What I'm going to talk to you about today is the world of work and the transformative and adapting to today's life and society in a new normal. So this is what I'll share with you today, and it's titled Adapting Life and Society to the New Normal World of Work. The three things that I want us to ponder on today, and things that I'm looking at in terms of an outline, is where will we be in 50 years? I want us to look at the world in the next trajectory, in the next 50 years. And what is important for us is to understand that everything and decisions that we take now in 2020 are going to actually have an effect in the long run. So that's why I have this beautiful staircase. I don't know how many can see that it's a staircase, but it's a staircase going upwards, and you start at the beginning. And anywhere you go in 2070, where we will get to in 2070 is a determinant of where we are now. The decisions that are taken economically, politically, socially, and environmentally, and in all facets of society, that will determine where we go. The three underpinning things that I will answer in today's talk is, what will our most valuable resource be, which affects our normal? How will the world be working, and what tech will transform our lives? So I think these for me are quite important to determining the type of society, to adapting to the new normal, and to the changing world of work that we're going to see in our future. Three things that I've pulled out from some of the research that I've done. The first, in the future, decarbonization of electricity is going to become a norm. What does that mean? That means that the type of energy that we see, the generation of energy, the supply of energy, the form of energy, is no longer going to be necessarily power-based alone in terms of coal generation, but you're going to look at alternative resources. You can see on the left-hand side, there's a massive green. That's the changing type of renewable energy, and that's your hydro, that's solar, that's wind. And this is a whole new economic sector, but also it's a supply to all economic growth and an underpinning value. The hydroelectric, nuclear as well, natural gas, all of these are in the mix, and they're really going to have an influence in the type of work, the type of industries, and the mode of work, because they affect your industrialization, they affect the output and the productivity, because we all know that without power, we cannot generate any output, and none of us can really do much without energy. There's different forms of technology that have been on the cards in the last 50 years that will be further developed. Nanotechnology you may know about, and then you talk about picotechnology, which is an advanced form of nanotechnology. I'm not an expert on technology, on science, on all of these nuances, but what I do see in the future is that these will be key in determining the type of work we have and the type of new normal that we will have. And I think the third and the last point is the level of automation. Systems that we use in our world of work, systems that we use currently right now have transformed in the last 3 months alone. I think many firms, many individuals are working from home, and we've seen what a lack of mobility has done in terms of advancing systems rapidly. I think what we've seen in the last 3 months alone, because of the pandemic, depending on this country you're from, we are going to see a similar type of leapfrogging across the globe. The buildings that we are going to be in, we've seen face recognition, hand recognition. I mean, these are the type of technologies we currently have. These will be advanced to another level. The type of automation in our offices, the type of automation even in our homes, and the systems that we use to build productive output is also going to be quite significant. So these are the three pillars that I think will determine even the type of work that we do and the world of work which we are going to be operating around. I just focus on the case of nanotechnology here. Very interesting. A little bit about nanobots and how they influence us. They really are about molecules and how molecules are built and how materials are built into a finished product by molecules. So they're called nanobots, where they interlock themselves into a basic skeleton. I mean, the type of tech we talk about is what we see in these futuristic movies that you'll see the pic in the middle there. If I could play a video, you would have seen that black material that literally forms on the skin all the way up to the neck, and it forms kind of a barrier that one can have because of the level of technology. Very interesting. But literally, molecules and nanobots are going to grow up around a person's body, crossing each other to create a weave pattern before taking shape into the shape of traditional clothing. What does this mean for us in the world of work? What does this mean for our new normal? Depending on the industry you're in, you may find that outfits are self-cleaning, outfits are self-fragrancing, which is quite exciting for some of us, especially in humid areas. Outfits will also adjust themselves in emergencies. They become harder, like steel or like knives. Fabric would be able to administer life-saving drugs. This has key implication for the world of work, particularly if you're in the healthcare sector. Medical nanobots and what they do in terms of wounds if you're in the military space. So the type of technology and the type of solutions that they can offer will be highly advanced, and I think this will affect the world of work. I think one of the most exciting and interesting things that I saw was that a firefighter, the type of things that they can now put on can protect them from hazards, from burning and radiation. And that's quite an improvement in terms of the world of work. I love economics. I'm an economist. And one of the things that I want to touch on definitely is the linkages between the economy and the labor market. Put this purposefully in the presentation so that we can understand that based on where you are in the globe, it does make a difference in terms of your ability to foresee what's going to happen in the world of work. If you look at the world from a historical growth perspective, from the last 10 years, I've compiled this from data from the IMF. You can see here that the contribution to global GDP, let's start here on the left, pre-2020. You go back here, what you can see is that on the main, the green is China in terms of its total contribution to output. The USA is the red. The EU and the northern OECD economies are all combined here, and other is in here in the gray area. What you see on average is that the world GDP, in terms of GDP growth, has somewhat declined, depressed, normalized, come up in the mid-2020s. However, we know that everyone will go back into a dip here because of the recession that many of us will face in contracting output due to COVID. What you're also seeing, which is quite interesting, is the role of the global south and the emerging markets that are growing in terms of contribution. Japan, OECD economies, the US and the EU, in the main, play the biggest role in terms of contribution, but we're seeing the rise of the global south, your Brazils, your Chinas, your Turkeys, your Indonesias, your Singapores coming in terms of scale. Quantum Africa in the main contribution is very minute, but many of the economies are the world's fastest growing. The forecasts are that globally, we would grow at around average 3.5, 3.9, and this has been changing, fluctuating over the last 3, 4, 5 years. Projections for next year as well will be compressed because of COVID. However, in the last few years, we've seen the fastest rates of economic expansion, particularly since the financial recession. However, there are some significant threats to the global economy. One, nationalism or trade protectionism and trade retaliatory measures amongst and between countries. We've seen this particularly between China and the US. The other thing we need to look at is the way in which monetary policy is used in advanced and even emerging economies. Emerging markets are highly vulnerable to shocks. We see this now with COVID-19, with the change in our currencies, with the depreciation, and with the volatility that is happening in our markets. There's many geopolitical tensions that will affect the global growth, and also COVID-19 and other health pandemics. Why is this important? Because a large interlinking happens between your economic growth and your labor markets, and you cannot miss the linkages between the two. The other thing that the World Economic Forum has looked at in terms of the future world of work, which I've taken directly from them here, is that the way in which the world has grown, and they've listed 10 specific items that talk about the type of economies we are creating and the type of future worlds of work, is that there is deepening income inequality. We're seeing very, very rich countries, very, very rich individuals, and a widening mass base of very wide poverty levels, particularly in different parts of the globe, Africa as well being one. Persistent jobless growth, and this is because of the type of growth we are having, which is a jobless growth, because you are having widening services level. So you've got 3 tiers in the economy: your primary, your secondary, and your services. If you have a very wide services sector, you're going to see highly professionalized staff entering there, and they're not as labor absorptive, hence the persistent jobless growth. Lack of leadership, rising geostrategic competition, issues around democratization. We have to look at the issue of sustainability, pollution, and water stress as key issues in the next few years, and also the importance of the health of our economy, which is rising in many countries, which are realizing that land and water and clean air is as good as a commodity as is any other factor of production. For if you don't have those, you're not going to be able to grow your economies. So you see on the continent, I like to compare Africa and the rest of the world. China, in terms of average growth rate, if you look at China there, you see the dotted lines. It's surpassed by far every country's economic growth. It's surpassed by far, let alone just the world economy, but also the fast growing economies, the biggest economies it has surpassed in terms of contribution to GDP. So their ability to grow has also affected demand for commodities and inputs that many of us, particularly on the continent of Africa, are producing. You see here that emerging developing economies are in the dotted line, which is at the bottom, surprisingly below what we as a continent are actually producing. Sorry, let me just rephrase that. The world average in the black dotted line here, you can see is slightly above the emerging and developing economies, excluding Africa and China. So you can see there that there is a slight minute difference towards the outer years, and in fact, it looks like there is a catching up in terms of the world and the emerging markets. So you can see that these are the key drivers that are key. Our GDP growth rate as a continent, if I quickly go back here, you can see that these bar charts show that the continent itself on its own is actually higher than the world average in terms of GDP growth rate. And that's because of your East African, Central African economies that are growing at around 8-7% per annum, much higher than the 3% of OECD and first world economies. Quickly to go to the next slide, you can see again here, countries are not homogeneous. And I'm saying this importantly because the effects of the change in global changes are not going to be the same across all countries. I've specifically pulled out South Africa here because I'm South African, but you can see that the South African per capita GDP in comparison to other emerging markets is declining. It's not the same. There are gaps. And it's important for us to understand that there are different levels of development across the world. Countries have different regions, even continental regions. On the continent, we have the Southern Bloc, the Eastern, the Central, the Western Bloc, and the North African Bloc, the MENA countries. And they all have different levels of development, different economic drivers, and outcomes are not equally distributed. For example, we have high level of inequality. Even though we have massive financialization and very advanced economies, we have a very much of a dual, what I call a dualistic economy. So it's important for us to understand that effects are not homogeneous. I broke it down here for us to understand and see per capita GDP changes on a country by country basis. China, for an example, we can see that on a compounded annual growth rate, they have surpassed everyone else. But if you go further down, Ethiopia is positive. It's one of the African countries that's really performing well. India, Turkey, Ghana, and Philippines. But Brazil, South Africa, and UAE are actually contracting in terms of per capita GDP growth. So it's important to have country-specific effects and country-specific measures to try and understand better the outcomes of all of our global moves and global changes. So you have emerging markets per capita in terms of GDP. Going back to the 3 points I mentioned, what will be changing in the world of work? What exactly? I like this image of bees because bees never sleep. they're always working. And I think that's really what's going to happen in the future. We won't have an 8 to 8. I don't know what is in your country, but people will work all round. Artificial intelligence, I think that we need to look at it from a position of, will we see substitution? I definitely see artificial intelligence playing a more prominent role, but the question is how? Will we see substitution, or will we be seeing a replacement of specific industries? And it's important for us to understand that we can either embrace the change, or we can see it as something that takes in our work and be defensive. So that MP stands for marginal productivity. Artificial intelligence, robotics, automation can actually improve productivity and enhance each additional unit of output more so than ever before. But the question is, will it also not substitute human, that word is supposed to be substitution, human contribution. And I think it's a question of economic policy at a national level and what your country promotes and the level of development you are in, so that you can deal with your country specific issues of inequality, poverty, and job needs in relation to that, vis-a-vis how you improve output and productivity. Because there's no point having machines running everything and half your country is not able to buy anything that the machines are making because no one has income. There will be a lot more focus on the knowledge economy, your ability to produce knowledge and output and produce value rather than just sitting on a desktop. I do believe that hours will change, the type of work we do. You'll have a lot more control over how you work, and the type of work that we are doing will also transform. I do believe care work will be compensated, which is not currently the practice. And many countries are going to review their laws to make sure that there's remuneration in this regard. I believe automation will be concentrated in certain sectors. For an example, manufacturing and agriculture. It's not all subsectors that necessarily will have need for machinery, but I think in those subsectors, it may replace jobs. However, these are the sectors where employment and labor absorption is highest. So I think labor unions, trade unions, there'll have to be a social contract in countries to look at how best to manage transition towards these artificial intelligence and improving productivity, but at the same time, not replacing humans, but retraining humans and managing that balance. It'll have to be done very carefully. Some industries you cannot replace. You cannot replace teachers with robots, I don't believe. You cannot replace artisans and nurses with robots, even doctors, psychologists. We need certain industries and only humans can do them. So sorry, the robotics won't take care of everything. I do believe creative economy and freelancing will definitely be on the rise as we are seeing the type of work that people are doing. I'd say nomadic type of work, digital nomads that we are seeing now, where people can do multiple things at different places, and yet because of the nature of the digital technology that we have. Humans will provide what machines cannot, and there's a lot we can do that machines cannot. The second question I ask is, what technology will transform our lives? I do believe that things like facial recognition, Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, artificial intelligence, fusion energy, DNA manipulation, particularly in healthcare, gene therapies and cell therapies. These are the things that will be game changers, I believe, particularly in ICT, telecoms, and even in energy. And so it depends which subsector you're in, but these technologies will literally change our lives. And I think if you look ahead in the next 50 years, where we will be, we'll definitely start seeing transformation in terms of the type of output, the amount of time it even takes for you to do things. And maybe we'll start meeting without meeting, and there'll be holograms. Someone will be right next to you and they actually not next to you in an office. I mean, we don't know what people will come up with in the future. I think the policy effect of this is that the kind of work that people will be doing will be very different. The kind of jobs, I'm not going to talk about the nature of jobs here. You're all MBA students, you'll be able to go and research that, but the nature of work that we are all going to be engaged in will be different. Policymakers, therefore, and education ministries will have to review their education systems, their curricula, to speak to the future jobs needed, to speak to the type of competencies that are required then to align with the future market needs and the growth needs that will be needed. Companies will also need to retrain adults for organizations. I want to then go to the next slide, is that we will have a lot more of you being digital nomads. You want to travel and work without an office, you'll be working from a digital office. We're seeing a lot more jobs that require labor being automated. So there'll be a lot of job replacement. Many of you in manufacturing are even starting to look at different modes and methods to replace humans, to replace them because they may be seen as cheaper, but also more able to produce output because of the repeated movements, in a sense that robots are able to do faster. Computers as well are becoming very interactive in the services sector. Some, you will know, some airports have no humans, but they have machines that are automated that enable for you to check in from entry to point of exit, and there's no need for humans. I don't know, we're not there yet where I am. And I think it would take a while for us to get there, but I think that these are some of the things where in the services industry in particular, there's a replacement by intelligent systems. So we have a choice. Either we stop the progress or we figure out a way to help those who are being displaced and who are going to be displaced. And I think there's a way to win that, but it requires leadership, it requires policy, and it requires us thinking ahead. And labor productivity driven by innovation will definitely increase us in the long run. The last question I ask is, what will be considered the most valuable resource? You can decide that for yourself. I'd like to put this up. I think most of us probably believe it's water. I think we all know that land as well is quite key. I think we all know that without inputs of consumption and productive land, clean air, we cannot operate as humans. Society cannot produce anything. And so I think these are critical also in our world of work, and how we work as our companies work, how we value sustainability, how we value an environmentally free and an environmentally sustainable society will also determine our world of work. And I think that these are key issues that have taken forefront in most of our economies now. So what are the key drivers and trends? Technology. I think millennials have changed their work, type of work, the level of mobility they want. The demographics in countries have changed. The type of population you're seeing has changed, particularly in OECD economies where you have much larger older population versus younger. I think the open markets and globalization, the data analytics industry and IT security, that's a new work, that's a new type of behavior that's being monitored and measured through those platforms and new subsectors of the economy, and just understanding the different nature of jobs and the type of jobs that will be changing. If you're in a manual job or a cognitive job where there's a lot of thought and thinking, you will need humans versus a manual job which can replace human with automated system. And very importantly, countries are homogeneous. Countries are not homogeneous. Countries are heterogeneous, and you need to look at the level of development, its future economic trajectory, and the nuances in the country before you make an assumption. So my last slide is, where were we 50 years ago? 50 years ago, we didn't have an ATM machine. You see on the left there that that's what it looked like. And here there's some other steps as to when you went to an ATM. It was revolutionary then. 50 years ago, South Africa did the first world heart transplant. And you can see there that the technology in the healthcare sector wasn't existing. And so you see there, 50 years from now, we'll be looking at some of the things that we've created now and think it's a joke. But then it was a big deal. So I wonder what will happen in the next 50 years. So I'll stop there for the new world of work, and I'll take questions. And thank you very much. And my contact details are there. Roshana, I will hand over to you to share some of the Q&A that I've received.
That's perfect, Doc. There's some questions in the chat box. I'm just going to ask you from Gillian Moodley. Can wearable technologies be applied to white-collar industries to measure levels of stress or burnout or development?
Just repeat that question again, please.
Okay, so it's, can wearable technologies be applied to white-collar industries to measure levels of stress or burnout or development of diseases in staff health and wellness during the new normal? Besides infringing privacy, what else must we consider?
Okay, I try to capture that, but it's a long-winded question. What you can do is put them in the chat function in our Zoom, okay, so that I can see them.
All right, let's go on to the next question then. I'll try and just get that question minimized a bit. Will we see a shift from technical focused skills like accountants or lawyers to creative focused skills? AI can replace the technical skills, but not the creative ones.
Yeah, That's a very important question because I think it talks about whole subsectors, and I think there's a lot of discussions around this in HR. But I do think that it's a phase thing. There's various factors I think we need to look at. It's not an automatic thing. So if you talk about the services sector, you have a growing services sector that services an economy, right? But if you look at the development stages of most countries, you cannot necessarily say where let's say Ethiopia is, where Ghana is, where I'd say Serbia, some of the Eastern European countries in terms of level of development, they have not necessarily extensively advanced their manufacturing subsectors and also industrialized to the extent that many of the first world economies have. So the level of development comes in part with the type of labor market, the type of labor market needs that you have. So your demand factors and your supply factors are very important in that as your economy grows, you have certain needs in an economy. So you can leapfrog over certain stages, but I do think that there's specific things that each economy needs to make sure that they don't negate. So fundamentals, industrialization is something that Europe has already done. Industrialization is not something that some emerging markets have done. They are still in that process. So you'll still require a certain skill set for that, and you can't surpass those. So going to the question on the professionalization or the technical skills, I think that many emerging markets and those that are still developing, for the next 10, 20, 30 years, you'll still need professionals. You'll still need those type of skill set. But those economies that are advanced, first world economies, they are at a much higher growth phase, and the type of sectors that they are growing are sectors that we may still be in infancy of. And they're not going to replace many of our sectors that are still growing. So I think that we need to have a phased approach and a phased look at those type of subsectors and the growth needs, in line then with the labor market needs. So I think that you need to look at those parallel and be very country specific. So I don't take a general answer in this one. You have to look at the continent, you have to look at the country, and then you look at the labor market needs vis-a-vis the country growth and the projections, and then you look at those specifics. But I do think in advanced economies, if that's where you are, there's a massive change in terms of the needs of the economy, particularly the growth of the services and the concentration of your automation. They may replace a lot of these professional jobs that you've mentioned.
And then the next question would be, how do you see the participation of women in this new world, or this new world of normal?
I think that what is for me very important is that there's various issues on the labor market where there's discrimination, where there's exclusion, where there's gender wage gaps, where we are seeing that on the main sectors where women are concentrated, particularly sectors where like nursing, care work, things that humans, I would say Adam Smith hasn't factored into the economic production model as measured contribution to GDP even, they're not paid for. So number one, in the future, if we can begin to see increase in payment for care work because of the change in the nature of economies, because of the importance put on care work, that would be a game changer, because currently you don't have that. Currently it's free work. When you help someone, when you do these type of things, it's not necessarily paid. The second I'd say is that the automation and the competition for jobs that will result in automation in subsectors will mean that there is a I think heightened level of competition. Already where you're seeing exclusion, your knowledge, your value contribution will speak more than factors that necessarily weren't important then. So I think that the diversity element has been proven research-wise to increase profit, to drive up outcomes, because it challenges people to think of solutions. And I think that you need to see diversity, and you need to see more women in corporates, in public entities, in senior management roles, in decision-making roles, because it's actually good for the country and it's good for your company. So I think that on the whole, not enough has been done around this. I mean, there's a lot of studies I could refer you to and cite you to, different countries at different levels. Generally speaking, the Nordic countries are doing very well in terms of these indices when you measure them, but many of us are not doing so great, and we need to improve.
And then there's also a question from Muratak. I fear we are blindly putting our faith in new technologies as the silver bullet to all our problems, and that the current direction of travel is inevitable. We need to be more considerate in our approach to adopting new technologies that are more human. What are your thoughts on this?
Okay, you want to know my thoughts on this? I think we shouldn't allow technology to replace people, as far as I'm concerned. I think that, yes, to improve productivity, but I come from a country where unemployment is over 40%. I don't use the narrow definition, I'm talking the broad definition. I come in a country where there's 60% unemployment for the youth. There's no ways we can use automation machinery to replace human productivity because we cannot afford that in our country. I do agree with your statement that there'd be many people who vehemently oppose what I'm saying, disagree flatly, because it's going to improve productivity, the shareholder value, you know, all those things. But it doesn't help, because if you have a 40% unemployment rate in my country, it doesn't help that you have people without access to basic household income. It comes with many social problems, crime, and many other things, youth unemployment, drug abuse. You can't have the masses of your people not working and having machines replacing humans. For what good? If you have profits, for what good? Because only a handful of those people will benefit from shareholder dividends payouts, and the majority of your population is left on the lurks. So I think that is left on the hinges. So I think it's important for you to look at what is the motive of using technology. I'm for it for productivity. I'm for it for innovation. I'm for it. I mean, technology solves problems. It's innovative. It gives you answers to big problems. Look at what's happened with M-Pesa in Kenya. It's helped with the provision of cash, transfer of money. It's empowered SMMEs, particularly microfinance, with the movement of money where you don't have infrastructure. And the regulation was enabling to mobile tech. So I think I'm not against technology, but I think in terms of replacing human form support, we need to review that and make sure that it doesn't disrupt our lives further and worsen the plight of people, particularly the poor and those who are not able to access resources. So we must carefully look at its benefits and its pros vis-a-vis the disadvantages and some of the cons that will come with.
And then there's a question from a fellow USBer. Moses wants to know, would you term the East and West African growth an inclusive growth? If not, what should those countries do to ensure it is inclusive?
Okay, so in inclusive growth, I'd have to analyze country by country. So I'm thinking East African growth. If we just look at, you said East Africa and West Africa, right? Okay, so that would be your Nigerias, your Ghanas, okay, I'll focus on Ghana. Ghana currently is probably the fastest growing economy, I think, in the world right now, or at least on the continent, let me say. I think its growth is around 8%, but in the last 2-3 years, it's had 7-6% growth, which is high. That's where China is. Why it's been inclusive, I'd say from a West African perspective. Inclusive because in the main, one of the biggest growth drivers is agriculture. And agriculture, we all know, is labor absorptive. We all know that countries have stages of development in terms of economically. So they move from primary production to secondary and also to high value added goods, tech goods and all that. So your economy won't always be based on a primary goods production. Usually most countries have parallel stages of development. And I think that they're also growing their services sector parallel to that. So I'd say that's inclusive growth. On the East African economy side, if you look at economies like Kenya, you also look at, I don't know, Tanzania, would I put it there, Sudan maybe. These countries, Ethiopia, yeah, the Horn of Africa, you're gonna see it's also experiencing one of the fastest growth rates, manufacturing being key. I think power generation is key in those countries. It could be slightly different to what's happening in Ghana. I think that you have to see there that there's big companies, multinationals, privatization of some of their state-owned enterprises. We know that the success of Ethiopian Airlines and the management thereof. So the models may be slightly different. The outcomes is what determines whether or not the growth is inclusive or not. And I think that inclusivity speaks to reduction of your inequality levels, your Gini coefficient in the main, your reduction of the bottom strata, which is the bottom 40% accessing income and wealth vis-a-vis the top income deciles of the top 10% and the concentration of wealth. I don't have those statistics right now, but I think that that's what I'd have to assess to make the determination. Roshana?
That was a very good, thank you for answering that one. There's one question from Lianla. Could you elaborate on the concept of a creative and a freelance economy? That's a good one.
Creative versus freelance. Creative is more like your, I'd say your media, entertainment, your arts, using your hands. Freelance economy is different slightly because I think any subsector could use freelancers. I'd see a freelancer as someone who doesn't have an 8-to-8 job, fixed term contract, permanent job, which is kind of the mode we have now. Freelancers, they work for themselves. They are not tied to any employer. They're kind of entrepreneurs, I'd say. And they're able to offer their services as and when they want, as and when they are needed to a certain supply. And so it's slightly different to a sector versus a type and a mode of work. So I think freelancers you see in certain economic subsectors much more. So you'd see freelancers in arts and entertainment in the creative sector more so than you'd see freelancers in financial sector or in government. I don't think you can freelance public service. I think because of the bureaucracy or higher education. You may get part-timers. I'm not sure if a part-timer can be defined as a freelancer, but I think you get my thinking.
Thank you. And then there's a question from Fernando on the back of a question that you answered earlier. Are there initiatives in developing countries to hold companies accountable for replacing jobs with AI or IoT, for example?
Okay, so that would be a policy question. So countries, depending on the economic policy and the labor regulation, would determine that. So the labor regulation policies or the basic conditions of employment, depending on the economic or the labor legislation and the economic goals. So, I mean, I think advanced countries, I don't foresee that ever happening in terms of people competing for jobs. Why? Because your unemployment levels, if they're under 7% or 6%, you don't necessarily have an unemployment problem. But if you do have a problem of unemployment where you're sitting at over 15% unemployment rate, I think that your countries need to look at legislation that ensures that companies manage the replacement of jobs with machinery. I haven't heard at this point any country necessarily spearheading that. I don't know who would spearhead that yet, but I think that it's something that's important for us to necessarily look at in terms of policy, because it will come to a point where there is no longer agreement between unions who would fight for the rights of workers against corporates who would necessarily want to increase their bottom line or see it as improving output and productivity. We must remember that with also large labor forces where you have massive unions, there are certainly some disruptions with strikes or things that the wage agreements, the costs of operating with the large labor force. So these are some of the factors that contribute to companies wanting to replace humans with automation. So I think these are the drivers. But I think you have to have a social contract where you win over management, corporates, but also labor must also improve productivity and output and ensure that to keep the jobs, they must produce and ensure that companies are able to generate returns as well and revenue in terms of earnings over time. So I think there's got to be a balance there. And I think we should look for the greater good of humans and our countries. And I don't think that it's good that you have a massive labor force that is retrenched and people are sitting around doing nothing. And then the social problems and the fiscus will have to service. You know, you'll need a bigger police force, you'll need bigger jails, you'll need bigger. So even the tax base will decrease, but you'll have problems that are increasing because the majority of your people are not working. So I think there must be a balance there where we try to manage these things.
Thank you, Doc. I think before you give your closing, if we can just go back to Gillian's question from earlier. Gillian wanted to know, can wearable technologies be applied to white-collar industries to measure levels of stress and burnout?
Okay, stop there. I hear you now. Wearable technology. So that's the nanotechnology. Can they be taken to white-collar jobs? I've never heard of that, but I see how they use the nanotechnology for materials. That would be quite something. I think you'd have to research that, Gillian, because it's quite an interesting question to look at how technology, because it stresses internal. all the things that I saw with the different technology where you put on a garment, it's kind of external, and it deals with external factors. But if you look at the internal effects of what you're talking about, stress, it's psychological. That's something else. I haven't seen that yet, but whoever creates that, I'm sure it will be a bestseller.
Thank you so much, Doc. We appreciate your time. In closing, I think that because you've kind of heard what the thinking of the students are at the moment, maybe you'd like to direct your closing to where we feel the future of not just women in business is going, but exactly where our countries are going from here on out. So thank you again.
Thanks, Roshana. Just my last round of comments. I think I'll say that humans are able to deal with change rapidly. I think that we've seen with the pandemic that we've all been touched by and affected by with COVID-19, humans can adjust, humans can change their way of life immediately. It's not even a question of maybe you transition. I mean, we had shut down for 60 days in this country and you could not leave your house. You could not leave your room except to go and buy food. And I think many of us had that. Industries had to review how they operate. Manufacturing was shut down completely in some subsectors. But you begin to see that actually there is a way for us to learn how to use technology in ways to ensure that we can get output done. There is a way for us to still communicate and talk to each other. There are ways for us to actually operate without having to compromise your health. And there's so many innovative ways where we actually were able to rise over the uncertainty of the times we're in. We're still seeing bouts of issues arising in different parts of the world, but in the main, I think the trajectory for me is that humans can get through anything. I am very positive to see that humans can also solve many things that we never thought we could solve potentially. We are able now to look at solutions to the pandemic problems in the rapid rates. I think company solutions, ability to work from home, get things done without seeing each other, the pace at which things are being done. The world of work is changing as we speak. The world of work we had 6 months ago is not the same as the world of work we have now. And I think that it's important for us to just acknowledge that and to acknowledge that human beings are able to adapt. And I'm very positive in terms of, as an African, as a South African, I think that technology will enhance our ability to produce. Technology will solve a lot of our problems medically, economic-wise, subsector-wise. Technology should be used to enhance productivity, but our people must be taken with the technology and not replaced by the technology. The people must be taken with the technology. The disruption is needed to improve productivity, but let's not disrupt our lives and exclude our people who have been excluded in the main for many things. I'm going to stop now and thank you all. Oh, I must still continue. I thought I was being told to stop. So I'm gonna say that I'm very positive for the continent. We've seen the growth effect of the pandemic being very bad on the southern part of the continent because of the structure of our economies. But very encouragingly, the economies in the central part, eastern parts, and northern parts of Africa have actually been able to see much less of an effect because of the massive manufacturing growth and the widening of industry, but also the growth of the primary sector, because humans need food, and the reliance on external inflows for food as a basic commodity we are seeing, you cannot leave that to other people. Nationalization of, let me say, the nationalist drive that is being seen as a threat globally, I think from an economic perspective is very important as a country, whether you are nationalistic or not. Can you produce your own basic goods and services? Can you produce fundamental goods if your markets are closed, if your shipping cannot happen, if you cannot import goods, which is what we've seen? And I think we need to really look inwards and say, what solutions must we produce? What industries must we make sure that we cannot do without? What must we as nations do to ensure that we are able to stand on our feet if the world shuts down? And I think the pandemic has shown us that. So we must be able to build our capabilities. Our leaders need to rise up, and our people need to work together with the leaders, because the leaders are not alone. So I want to thank you and say I'm very positive the continent will grow. All the best to you, and enjoy the rest of your week.